Assalamu alaikum everyone. We are back with another lecture. So far we have been primarily focusing on the history of English literature, but now we are going to shift the gears a little bit. But before that, I'm sharing with you your first assignment. The submission date will be shared right after this class. So your first assignment is define literature, examine the role of history in shaping the literature of a country or a society. Conversely, how literature can influence the course of history. This is your first big task. Brainstorm for ideas, research on it, and make it compelling and impressive. You do not have to just stick to English literature. You can talk about broader global literature, including Pakistani context. For the next few lectures, we will be pausing on our history lessons and examining the main genres of literature. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term genre itself, what is it? Genre basically means types or classifications. It is a term used for classifying literature into certain categories based on the style of writing. Traditionally, literature is classified into three main genres, which are further divided into subgenres. The main genres are poetry, drama, and prose. We will be looking at these three individually in the upcoming lectures. So, as usual, let's begin with a warm-up exercise. Let's play a quick game. I will read two lines and you have to guess which one is poetry. One is from a newspaper article and the other is an actual poem. So tell me which sounds like poetry. First line is, the sun rose at 5:10 a.m. and the temperature reached 40 Celsius by noon. Second line is, the sun, a golden coin, rolled slowly across the sky. Which one feels like poetry and why? You've probably noticed that the second line is imaginative, emotional, and rhythmic. That difference is exactly what we are exploring today. What makes poetry different from other mediums of literature? Before that, let's define the term. Poetry is the oldest form of literature and yet the hardest to define. Different critics have tried and come to different conclusions. Some of them are Samuel Johnson, who said poetry is simply metrical composition. Wordsworth gave the most popular definition. He described it as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility or peace. Shelley called it the expression of imagination. Matthew Arnold went further, calling it a criticism of life itself. For those, from all of these, we can agree on just one thing. Poetry is a language shaped by imagination, rhythm, and feeling to express truths about human life. It is not just facts, it is experience transformed into art. Just like certain songs or music have an impact on you, poetry has the same impact on literature. So now let's talk about the nature of poetry. Poetry is based on imagination and emotion. At its heart, poetry is not cold logic, but feeling set to language. It transforms everyday experiences into something memorable. For example, you might be familiar with Daffodils written by Wordsworth. It is often taught in FSC and metric level. This poem takes a simple walk by a lake and turns it into a meditation on joy. Secondly, poetry also has rhythm and meter. What is it? We will be discussing about it in the further lectures. But poetry often uses patterned language, beats, sounds, and rhymes that mirror the pulse of life. Even free verse has rhythm in phrasing. We will be elaborating that in the upcoming lecture. Third, language is a concentration when it comes to poetry. Poetry uses language at its highest level. A poem packs layers of meaning into very few words, unlike a novel or an essay, which has a lot of time and word count. Now, before we move further, let's have a little food for thought. Think of your favorite song lyrics. Isn't it just a few lines, but somehow it says more than a whole speech? We all have that one song that we think that shaped us. That's the power of poetic language. Now, let's talk about the function of poetry. Why we ask what poetry does? What does it mean? We are really asking human beings across all cultures and centuries how poetry has turned into something aesthetic, emotional, moral, and something that has a social function. Let's unpack these. First, poetry is the interpretation of life. It doesn't give facts or statistics, it interprets emotions emotionally. Wordsworth argued that poetry arises from the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. We just talked about that, which means that poetry shows us life as it feels, not as it is. Next, revelation and discovery is at the core of poetry. It reveals hidden truths of life and emotions that ordinary speech cannot even capture. And poetry is also an emotional expression and catharsis. Aristotle, one of the greatest poets and critics, says that poetry is a way of releasing emotions. It gives us a form of catharsis, of spiritual awakening. Through poetry or hearing something, we can confront our grief, joy, anger, or love and process those powerful feelings safely. Next, poetry allows us the pleasure and beauty beyond philosophy. Poetry delights us through sound, imagery, and form. Pope's essay on criticism may teach, but its beauty is in the music of its lines. The beauty of a ghazal by Ghalib lies not only in its meaning, but also in its exquisite turns of phrases and melody of words. Next, poetry is the social political reformation of a society. Poetry often serves as a protest, a form of resistance or reform. For example, for us, Iqbal's poetry inspired Muslim selfhood and political awakening in South Asia. Next, poetry also allows for the preservation of memory and identity. Poetry preserves collective stories, myths, and traditions. Next, we will be discussing about the main types of poetry. It is a vast field, but we can still group it into its main forms based on a traditional way of classification. There are many other ways, but we will be focusing on these three. So traditionally, poetry is divided into lyrical poetry, narrative poetry, and dramatic poetry, with many subforms under each. What is lyrical poetry? It is a short, personal, and emotional expression of someone's feelings, often in first person. These are some of its subforms include a sonnet. A sonnet is a 14-lined poem tightly structured, often about love or reflection. Next, subcategory is ode. It's a dignified, often elaborate lyric that celebrates a person, idea, or an object. Next, elegy. Elegies are basically mournful poems about someone's death and loss. Most common poems are Thomas Gray's An Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, Shakespeare's sonnets, Keats' Ode to the Nightingale. These are some of the popular poems in lyrical poetry. Next, let's talk of narrative poetry. These are the poems that tell a story through characters, plots, and events. Subforms include epic, a long narrative about heroes and national identity. Ballads are shorter narrative poems often sung with repetitive refrains. For example, narrative poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge or Milton's Paradise Lost are examples of narrative poetry. Lastly, let's discuss about dramatic poetry. These are the poems written for performances as speech or dialogue. Often they are included in dramas like Shakespeare's plays or Sophocles' tragedies. There are also dramatic monologues that are about a narrator speaking something. For example, the most famous is My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. So, what is the purpose of talking about that? What is poetry? Poetry is the imagination, emotion, rhythm of that shapes language into art. Its function is not to give us facts, but to make us see and feel life more deeply. And it comes in many forms: lyric, narrative, dramatic, but always with the same purpose: to reveal, to delight, and to move. Poetry should not only be studied, it must be enjoyed. The best way to understand poetry is simply to read it out loud and let it sing to you. Just like when you hear a nice song or something musical, you listen to it. You pay attention to what is being said. You do not talk about the deeper implications behind it. First, you listen, and sometimes even the symphony is enough to leave an impact on you. Treat poetry in the same way. Not every poem is going to resonate with you, but every poem is universal for a reason. It has its own audience. Not every poem is made for everyone. In the same way, not every person is going to be someone you like. So keep this in mind in the coming lectures. That being said, we will still be focusing on how do we study poetry when we study literary studies, because in your future courses you will be analyzing chunks of poetry. And that is all for today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will be primarily focusing on how do we study poetry, what are the things we have to keep in mind when analyzing the text, what are the different parts of a poem, and also we will be talking about the different figures of speech and different dimensions that we pay attention to while studying a poem. And to recap, there are many different types of poetry, but the main types that are very commonly studied in the course of literature are sonnets, odes, elegies, and epics. So we will be primarily focusing on these subcategories. And keep this in mind, poetry is the expression of feelings and language. So it's not just about the theme, it's not just about the language itself, it's a mixture of both and how it creates music and beauty within it. That is all for today's lecture, and till next time, Allah Hafiz, see you soon.